Welcome to Proudly Asian, a podcast series that tells bold and proud stories of Asians by Asians. I'm Isabel Wong, a financial journalist who wants to uncover the many Asian stories around us that are waiting to be told. There's never just one way to look at Asians. This podcast will take you through a deep dive into the life stories, struggles, and triumphs of young Asians around the world. On today's episode, we have Yeshi Jampa and Julie Kleeman, the English-Tibetan husband and wife team who co-authored the cookbook Taste Tibet: Family Recipes of the Himalayas. Together, they run the Oxford-based restaurant Taste Tibet. They talk to us about nomadic Himalayan food culture and practices, mindful living and eating, and the unique flavors of Tibet. Welcome to Proudly Asian, Yeshi and Julie. Thank you so much for making the time for us and joining us from Oxford. How are you doing today?
We're doing great.
Doing great, thank you.
Great. And I gotta say, when I first learned about your story, it was actually through your recent book launch. I saw your book title, which is Taste Tibet and Recipes from the Himalayas. And I was so intrigued because I was like, well, you don't really hear about Tibet every day, and let alone Tibetan food. So I was so intrigued by the story, the recipes, and I just couldn't help but reaching out to you to get to know more about your story and let our listeners know about the journey from Tibet, India, and eventually to Oxford. But to start off the conversation, I would like to get into the basics. Tell us about your background, Yeshi and Julie. Who are you, what are you, and where did you grow up?
So I'm from Tibet. So I grew up like a very rural place and semi-nomadic family. Yeah, what about Julie?
We couldn't come from more different worlds, really. So, yeah. She was born and brought up in very rural part of Tibet and spent 6 months of the year away every year, accompanying family members and their livestock up on the high pastures of the Tibetan plateau. And he never went to school until he left Tibet. At the age of about 19, he walked across the Himalayas to India, and that's where his formal schooling began. About 4 years, I think it was, in India. He learned to read and write and some basic maths. And for me, I was born and brought up in London, and I was privately educated and went to Cambridge University, and I studied Chinese there. I first visited China in 1992. I was just 17 at the time, and China was still quite a kind of wild place to visit, especially for independent travelers. It was the very early days of independent traveling inside China. And I really just had an amazing time and completely fell for the place. I always had a love of language, and I went on to study Chinese at Cambridge. And eventually I lived in Beijing for many years. And it was during that time that Yeshi and I met, because although my main job at the time was in publishing, I was the chief editor of the Oxford Chinese Dictionary. I also used to sideline in NGO work, and I visited India to write a report for a British government-funded project, in fact, working with people with disabilities in the South Asian region. And at the end of that work visit, I just tacked on a week's break to Dharamsala, which is the Indian Himalayas. And that's where Yeshi was living at the time. So he'd been in India for about 10 years at that point.
Wow.
And he'd been living all over and doing all kinds of things. And it just happened that we were both walking the same stretch of road on that particular day.
Yeah, I mean, it's so intriguing how you were interested in China and somehow you just went to start working, and also Yeshi's story about walking almost a month from Tibet to India. Those are some really interesting stories, but I would like to get into a little bit about what it was like growing up in Tibet. What are some of the experiences that would bond most people who grew up in Tibet?
I don't know, but something I'm so lucky, I was born in a rural place. It's just so close to the nature, and there's so many animals. I talk with my children. I have children here, so I have lots of animals. And just winter, also still we play with the ice. I remember just just we have lots of ice outside in winter time. And the summer as well. We get out the summer, sometimes we have summer snow as well. Just beautiful place. And it's just unbelievable, beautiful place in Earth, really. And a lot of rivers, we can drink any rivers, everything's clean. And no plastic, Now I'm thinking like when I grow up, so I'm so lucky.
Wow. And I mean, certainly it's a different life to anyone who grew up in the city like myself. I could not imagine being surrounded by animals, but in a way it would be a pretty fun experience. But for Julie yourself, when you first visited Tibet, what was your first impression?
So the first time I visited Tibet, I was a tourist. In fact, it was the region that I went to anyway. The places I visited felt like the most pristine places I had ever seen. Really kind of amazing lakes with mountain backdrops. And I remember I did like a kind of horse tour. And I was just so struck with the beauty of the place. Not initially by the food, but I subsequently understood that I was eating all the wrong things there.
But I know a lot of interviews you've got asked about your love story. And I mean, I'm sure a lot of people who know about you guys, they have already known how you met. But for our listeners who might not be completely familiar with your story yet, would you mind telling us about your love story?
So we met by the side of the road, as I mentioned, and we were both actually photographing the same monkeys. So at that time of year in northern India, it actually gets very cold. And these monkeys, they're called Himalayan langurs, and they usually roam the higher reaches of the Himalayas. But during the colder months, they have to descend in order to find the right food. They're vegetarians, actually. So quite different to those red-bottomed monkeys that you're more usually familiar with in India. And Yeshi knew these monkeys, which are quite large in size, not to be hostile in that way at all. And so what I remember when we first laid eyes on each other was that he was going in much closer to take his photograph, whereas I had been hanging back. I was a little bit timid. These are kind of quite large beasts. And I remember that I said to him, "That's a good idea." So that's how we got chatting. And then we walked up the path together looking for more of these monkeys and eventually taking some tea together. And that evening, Yeshi invited me to the room that he shared with a Tibetan friend. And it was just a single room with a kitchen in the corner, a very sparse setup. It was 2 gas rings just fired by this single gas cylinder. No kettle, no frills at all. So I really wasn't expecting much in the way of any kind of food. But he cooked me up the most amazing hand-pulled noodle soup, which on a cold November night was everything I needed in that moment. It was just, and really came to define my understanding of Tibetan food, which comes into its own in those kind of circumstances when it's cold outside and you just need something warm in your hands to comfort you and provide you with kind of nourishment and fuel.
Wow, so it was like a hug for the stomach in the form of noodles.
Exactly.
That's such a beautiful story. But of course, eventually you guys went from India and now you're in Oxford. You both share 2 beautiful children. And I just want to know, was language ever a barrier for your marriage? And how did the first meetings go with Yeshi or Julie's parents?
Language is still a barrier.
I think somewhere it's good, but we understand. Somewhere it's much better than a little bit have the language issue.
In some ways it does help. We understand that we have limited language at our disposal, so we have to express ourselves very clearly. You can't hide behind words, which I think does happen when 2 people share a high level of one language. So yeah, we have to speak very clearly. And that's helped us. As far as meeting each other's parents goes, I mean, I didn't meet my in-laws until Yeshi and I had already been married many years and had 2 kids. I think they were 4 and 2 at the time that we made the first trip back to Tibet. And so my parents met Yeshi before then. And I think as soon as they met him, they were okay. But the prospect of Yeshi as my future life partner when it was just a notion and before it became a reality. And I always said to them, if they had the opportunity to meet him for themselves, they would be fine and much reassured. And so it came to pass. But before then, I can't say that there was much enthusiasm.
Oh, wow.
about that prospect.
But I know, Yeshi, you eventually moved to England in the year of 2011.
Yeah.
So how has the experience been for you living in England, a place that you didn't know much about before? And were there any good moments and what were the challenges?
Challenges, obviously I missed where I'm from. It's very, very different, sometimes I go here as well. Sometimes I go countryside to see the animals. Still I do. But that's a huge part I missed that. And also families, all the behind. So it's hard. Anybody can live in a different place. It's hard. But in some ways, it's beautiful. Just, now I have children, wife, and we settle here. So I'm happy one side. So.
And he's got a dishwasher and a washing machine, and I think
it helps.
I know.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think it's frustrating for Yeshi because also his English is good enough, but not necessarily at the level at which he would be able to communicate all the things going on inside his head. And I think that as somebody who comes to the UK with a completely different perspective, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in there. And some of it is really quite surprising. And I think that something that was a shock to him when he first arrived here, coming to, as far as he was concerned, a very highly developed country was the level of dissatisfaction and high rates of poor mental health. We initially had a market stall in town for many years, and it was quite an exposed place where we would often chat to and feed homeless people and other people who were quite displaced. And I think it was quite a shock to realize that even in a place where people apparently, or the system apparently provides everything, there's still so many problems, and quite depressing, I think, for you. And I think rather than that becoming less depressing over the years, it's possibly just become more depressing. But obviously the state of the world has also deteriorated over this time.
Yeah, I must say I'm very inspired by how you guys, despite the challenges posed by the pandemic, still continued with your charity work. You guys still continue to feed homeless people. So I was very touched by the efforts that you guys were making, even when times were hard for you guys. But we will get into the story and the journey of you guys setting up your restaurant a little bit later in the conversation. But now I would like to zoom into the life in Tibet and basically Tibetan culture. And to start off, I just want to know if you guys could tell us about what a day in the life of a Tibetan is like.
Day in the life. But depends which kind of part,
and what time of year.
One time of the year. And also most in Tibet live in nomad area, just, most like on the mountains, lots of animals. And they obviously need to work hard, but also, just I've been in so many different countries, but in Tibet is the, world the beautiful country in the earth, I think. So, and some is very, very lucky. They just work hard, but also just, where they live, so just very, very nice.
There's less concept of time, isn't there? It's not the case that life is ordered according to what week it is or month it is, and and there's no such thing as an alarm clock except for the chickens. That's true. That's exactly true. And we have lots of chickens in the morning. They're just screaming in the morning. Otherwise, just. Then it's time to get up, and you'd have a bowl of butter tea and some.
Butter tea, zambas, and then. So we need to also kind of busy with the animals. So we need to work with animals, but just the life is not that pressurized. Just
I suppose that it does depend on what day you're talking, and there will be times of the year where there probably is quite a lot of pressure to get stuff done.
Some harvest tend to a little bit from away from, but it's quite. But still, if you finish today, otherwise you can work tomorrow.
Wow.
So that's
That's so nice. In a way, I think it just sounds like you basically listen to your body. Let's say, like, if you're tired, you rest. And when you have rested enough, then you get up and continue doing what you're supposed to do, as opposed to like people who grew up in the city. Like, we're always so restricted by time and what we think we should be doing, even though we're tired. So I think, in a way, how Tibetan people live their lives is super close to the concept of wellness and mindfulness to us people in the city. But the next question is, this is rather an abstract question, but I would like to just get your thought in terms of what is the real Tibet, what languages are spoken there, and what are some of the key festivals and occasions that were observed in Tibet?
So, yeah, we use Tibetan language.
But that's quite different end to end. I mean,
Yeah.
I know that Yeshi says when he arrived in India and met people from other parts of Tibet, initially it was quite hard to understand them. Because, I mean,
the dialogues are different, very, very different, like in England, like, but yeah, like Birmingham and Manchester, it's a very, very different way to understand each other, but it's a Tibetan language, but
Tibet is much, much bigger than the UK, so...
Yeah, it's just a big country, and also where they live, so that is separate. Isolate each other, and the language is quite hard to understand each other, but we're same grammar, but it's different dialogue.
I see. And what about any, the biggest festivals that would be celebrated in Tibet? What are some of the key times of the year?
We have summer festival as well in Tibet in June, probably here, maybe August. The summer festival, and then New Year's the key celebrate in Tibet. So we have the horse racing and play archery, and
there's even a whole festival celebrating yogurt.
Oh wow!
I mean, that's a summertime festival, and generally speaking, apart from New Year, which is lunisolar, so it usually happens at the same time as Lunar New Year elsewhere in Asia, which is like elsewhere in Asia, an opportunity for a lot of feasting, singing, dancing in the case of Tibetans. But in the summertime, because obviously Tibet is very cold for most of the year, and in the summer people really enjoy, they take picnics out on the grassland and make the most of the good weather when they can. And
it's kind of like a Tibetan summer holiday.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a beautiful tent, and just...
they'll bring sofas, they'll bring TVs even, don't they now? I mean, if that's possible. I mean, they'll pretty much kind of transplant the living room to inside a beautiful tent out on the grasslands.
That sounds so nice. It's like a more advanced way of doing picnic, because I just have my basket of food with me. I don't even have a sofa or TV. But for the rest of us, we just hear about the place Tibet. We don't really know much about the culture, the place, and the people, and the languages spoken even. So I just want to know, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about Tibet or the Tibetan culture?
Well, firstly, I think we mentioned that, in most people's minds, Tibet is a very tiny place. And the kind of number one thing is that it's actually huge. I mean, it's about the size of the whole of Western Europe or Alaska and California combined. So we're talking a massive area that isn't necessarily inhabited in all parts, because certainly much of northern Tibet is pretty much uninhabitable. I mean, it's at such high elevation and so little grows there that very few people choose to settle there, or nomads, will spend some parts of the year there, but their homes will be elsewhere.
Most wild animals, churu and or waryak.
The chiru is a kind of deer, whose fur is much prized, sadly, for scarves outside of Tibet.
Right.
So quite a lot of hunting and poaching happens in these wilder areas. So that's a really big one. And then a job that we find we have to do most of the time, even with customers who've been visiting us under the banner of Taste Tibet for years, is to explain repeatedly that Tibet is not the same as Nepal. So it's quite a distinct country with its own customs, language, traditions. And like we said, I don't know how many times Nepal would fit into Tibet, but so much larger.
Yeah, and I remember in one of your Instagram posts, you also mentioned some people might think momos were actually Nepalese food rather than Tibetan. But then now as a Tibetan, Yeshi, what is it that you want to tell the world about Tibet? What is that one thing that you want them to know?
Tibet is really, really important for the whole Asia because all the rivers come from Tibet. So without Tibet, whole Asians, all the waters, where the resources come from Tibet. So Tibet is really, really important to the whole kind of world and the whole Asian, because if we will not look after the environmentally in Tibet, and then the whole Asian become suffering in the future.
So again, something that people
climate change,
don't understand.
Yeah, they don't understand how important Tibet is, because all the big rivers come from Tibet, China, India, Pakistan, Burma. All the big resources come from Tibet.
Wow.
So it's an area of outstanding natural beauty, but also, considerable importance for the region as a whole.
Yeah, so in a way, Tibet is actually crucial in terms of making sure the food security in most of Asia, basically. But since we are now talking about food, I would like to focus more on your journey in terms of setting up your restaurant and also your newly launched cookbook. Now, on your restaurant, 6 months after you started your festival food stall, Taste Tibet, which was what Taste Tibet was before it became a restaurant, The Guardian named you as Top 10 Budget Eat in Oxford. The BBC Good Food magazine also named you in their Oxford Top 10 in 2017, among some of the amazing achievements that you guys got along the way. So could you tell us about the journey of starting your own Tibetan food store and restaurant? Was it challenging to get people to try out Tibetan food initially?
Do you know, it wasn't actually. We should backtrack a bit by saying that, quite kind of in true Tibetan style, there wasn't an awful lot of planning that went into all of this. It was, kind of not here today and then, suddenly out there and without a long-term plan. And it took us many years to get ourselves a logo or any kind of banner. So it was quite makeshift for a long time. And the menu also kind of grew organically, but it started in quite a safe place with dumplings, momos, the steamed Tibetan dumplings. And I think because that's a food that people were familiar with, even if they'd never tried momos before, most people love dumplings. We didn't have any trouble drawing people in. And then when we added curries and stir fries to the menu, again, although they have some distinct flavors, the concept in of itself was not that alien. And I think also we were quite lucky because we're based in Oxford, it's a small city, but a very international city. So we immediately found that we were feeding people from all over the world who were quite open-minded in terms of their food tastes.
Yeah, for sure. Dumplings and curry, what's not to like? But of course, you also recently launched a new cookbook. Congratulations, by the way. It's called Taste Tibet, Family Recipes in the Himalayas. Could you tell us a little bit more about the book? How did it all start? And what was the process of creating the book?
So we have really, really the good customer, and the customer wants to ask me to write the cookbook. And so the customers push us to write in the cookbook. And
we started writing a blog back in 2016. In fact, we started writing about Tibet and the food that we were cooking even before then, when in the very early days of Taste Tibet, we used to run a takeaway from our own home. So we had a mailing list of people who were mostly local to our area. And every week we'd send them out an email with the menu. We asked for them to pre-order. And we'd always include a kind of a story or a recipe or some kind of piece of news from Tibet. And those, as Yeshi said, those earliest customers really encouraged us to work up these stories. They wanted to see more. And in the end, as he said, this was really a book for them because of their repeated demands for it. But, you know, from our side also, it very much chimed with the vision that we have overall, which is to bring the name of Tibet to wider audiences through food and through our restaurant and our food stall. Our capacity is limited. We can only reach the people who, you know, are physically able to find us. But through the book, we were able to share a lot of our backstory and something of the history and culture of Tibet and these recipes much more widely. So that's really exciting to us that we're able to now have, global reach. The cookbook is out not just in the UK, but Australia, New Zealand, the US, and shortly Germany. So, you know, that's amazing to be able to communicate so widely.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's a shame that I'm not physically in Oxford to try out your momos, but I promise I'll make my way there because I can't wait to try out your momos. They just look so good in the photos, and I would like to get my hands on some of those chili oils as well. But, but in essence, what does it mean to be eating and cooking the Tibetan way?
In Tibet, we understand much better from the nature where we live. So we're close to the earth. And like in the cities, like we just live a distance where the foods come from, and we don't know how to like meat, how organic is it? You know, in Tibet, like everything is organic because we know what is the land, and we treated the animals all the summers on the mountains, not like in a small area. So that's why hopefully the books, people understand how we eat and where the foods come from, so people can learn something.
So basically, you can't take any shortcuts when you grow everything yourself and you rear the animals that you ultimately consume. I think what you're saying is you live very close to all of this, and you know intimately where your food has come from. And so if you ask about the essence of Tibetan cooking, it's always made from scratch. You know, there's never, I don't think I've ever seen Yeshi ever cook with anything like a pre-prepared sauce, for example, or someone else's chili oil. You know, he makes everything from scratch. It's really important to him that he understands exactly what's going into his food. And I think that comes from the way that you learn to cook back in Tibet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And in a way, it's kind of like it makes one to source and also consume the food responsibly. And I also remember reading, you know, one of your blog posts, you also mentioned the Tibetan food culture. It's kind of like a collective experience because no one eats alone. It's kind of like a big meal for a lot of people, you know, coming together to eat, to experience the festivities and food and just basically the happiness together. But the other thing, since you launched a cookbook, I would also like to get your thought into Asian food representation in the global market. I just want to know what is key in terms of bringing Asian food to a global audience. Did you have to adjust any of your recipes so it might be a bit easier for the Western audiences to adapt? And how does one strike a balance between staying true to the food culture, staying authentic while promoting a cuisine or culture that most people don't know much about?
I think when it comes to the cookbook, there was a little bit of everything. Yeshi's been in the UK for 11 years now. And so the food in our cookbook really represents what he's cooking on a daily basis at home and in the restaurant. And so therefore he's using ingredients that are available here and not able to draw on some of those more unique ingredients that we're not able to source here. Yak meat, for example, which is a really important part of the Tibetan diet, is simply not possible to get hold of that here. Yak cheese as well, yak butter. So these particular things, which would feature very large in the Tibetan diet at home, are not a part of our daily Tibetan diet here in the UK, and so they also don't feature in our cookbook. I think we tried to get a balance of really traditional recipes. So we couldn't, for example, leave out Jampa, which is roasted barley flour, the other thing that Tibetan people eat every day, and some nomads just live off Jampa pretty much for some months of the year. This is a very so barley grows well at high altitude. It's the only grain that really can. And you can enjoy it in all kinds of ways, but you roast it and then you ground it to the consistency of flour, and it can then be enjoyed with boiling water as a kind of porridge. You can even make bread out of it, but most commonly it would be mixed with just enough boiling water and butter and sometimes cheese to form a kind of the best way I've come to describe it is something that has the consistency of Play-Doh. So it's a snack that you could easily put in your pocket in that form, and just it's like a snack. And it can be savory or it could be sweet. You could add sugar.
Yeah, it's a very flavor, nutty flavor. And it's very rich. And then also we believe that I think for like good for the, like in Tibet, like most people like not looking like our weight, looking, we don't have that. And that's good for the diabetes as well.
It's nutritious.
Yeah. And it's very for healthy, it's really.
I mean, generally speaking, if you're eating what is locally available, you're likely to be eating what is best for you. And we all know that in theory, but I think the Tibetans are quite a kind of living example of that.
Nice.
Anyway, so we have Jampa in our recipe book, and then we have other dishes in the book that use Jampa as an ingredient if you're able to make it or come by it. But, it's usually not essential. So the book has a mix of recipes, really, and includes also a chapter of dishes that Yeshi himself came up with as a result of the many years that he spent in India. And you'll find if you go to Tibetan restaurants outside of Tibet, the same story wherever you go, because most Tibetan people have made their way out of Tibet via India or via Nepal, and each of them has made their own unique journey, and so created their own unique recipes, received different influences along the way. So we've got some very traditional dishes in there. We've got the dishes that we make at home every day that are definitely Tibetan and maybe sometimes miss an ingredient here or there, but generally speaking, not really.
Yeah, the most, when I was young, I learned from my parents. Well, my parents are really, really good cook. And so lots of dish from my parents, really.
And I think one thing is that if you are... you eat very seasonally in Tibet, or if you're a long way from home and your options are quite limited, the way that Yeshi grew up learning to cook, you're quite used to just cooking with what is available, what you have to hand. So there's never anything that you can't do without, and you can always substitute one thing for another. You learn quite quickly what ingredients go well together, what types of ingredients will work together. And so we think that readers will be really quite surprised and reassured to learn that actually there's a lot of flexibility with these recipes in the same way.
Wow. In a way, like Tibetan cooking sounds a lot like the art that studies the relationship between the landscape and like what's available. But then, I mean, here's a question for you both. Like Yeshi and Julie, what's your favorite Tibetan dish other than momos?
Some handmade noodles, they're really, really, really good. I really love it. The noodles are just, you can cook really Tibetan way. You can cook, or if you don't, you can use like kind of pasta. You can make sauce and with the noodles fresh. It's just so delicious.
But whether momos or noodles, everything is made with just plain flour and water. So, also if you're making momos but you have a bit of dough left over, you can use that to make a little bowl of noodle soup. My favorite is the one that Yeshi cooked me that first night we met, which is called in Tibetan hand-pulled noodles. So you're basically stretching out long pieces of dough and then pinching off the end of these pieces and chucking them into a bowl of, a pot of boiling water with whatever veggies and, if you like it, meat that you have to hand. We have a lot of, this is called tentu. We eat tentu a lot at home. It doesn't have to be winter to enjoy it.
Amazing. It sounds like comfort food already, even though I haven't tried it yet. But since momos is actually one of the signature dishes of Tibetan food, I just want to know, what is the secret of making the best momos?
Everything scratch.
From scratch.
From scratch. And the dough is important, and also filling as well. So you need both balance.
Freshest possible ingredients.
Yeah. So I think just if you cook everything fresh, and it just all become delicious,
Simplicity is key. As we mentioned, your wrapper is only made with simple flour and water. And then again, whatever ingredients it is that you have to hand, as long as they're fresh and as long as you can be sure that they'll work well together, you're going to have a nice momo at the end of it.
Yeah, and for those who are curious on how to really make the best momos, I recommend you to go check out Yeshi and Julie's cookbook. Get yourself a copy. It's called Taste Tibet, Family Recipes in the Himalayas. And for those who happen to be in Oxford, just go check out the restaurant, Taste Tibet. I can't wait to pay a visit when travel eventually opens up here in Hong Kong. But now it's time for us to move on to the next segment, which is called Rapid Bias. In this segment, I'll be asking my guests biased questions they have got asked at some point in life, and also some common biased questions Asians get asked a lot as well. So, Yeshi and Julie, are you ready?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go. First question. Tibet is basically Nepal.
Yes, no. Different.
Yeah, we get this a lot. We must, I brought my friend to taste your delicious Nepalese food. The clue is in the title. The cuisine is actually really distinct from Nepal, and the culture and the language and everything. There's very little in common between the two places. Because
we are first arrived in Nepal. I have no idea what they say. Completely different country. And it's just, I worked for hours in the city. It's just, I don't understand what their language. Yeah, so this is totally different.
Obvious to us, but it seems apparently not at all obvious to other people.
And next question. Tibet is a very small place.
No, but we don't have many people live there. But mostly just animals. Wild animal and domestic animal.
All Tibetans are devout Buddhists.
This is interesting. I mean, I think all Tibetans are Buddhist, but I would say that the majority of Tibetan people wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what that meant. I mean, Yeshi always said to me that he felt like calling himself a Buddhist was a very big claim, because he lived for many years inside a monastery complex, so not as a monk, but as a kind of lay worker inside a monastery complex in India. And when you see close at hand what it really means to take Buddhism to a high level, you're talking about a lifetime of study. And I think so only the monks, and only the monks who take it that far, and nuns too, of course, would really be able to make that claim.
Yeah, but you said I'm Buddhist, but I don't know much, You can't say that if you don't know much, I'm Buddhist. It is kind of,
But I think that one thing that you could say is true is that there is a Buddhist way of living that Tibetan people very much observe, which is others before self. Always look after the people around you before you take care of your own needs. And that's something that Tibetan people themselves may not be able to tell you is a Buddhist concept, but it's certainly a guiding principle in their lives.
And the next one is, Tibetans don't eat meat.
Yeah, a lot of our customers assume that Tibetans would be vegetarian because, again, they're assuming that Tibetans are all devout Buddhists. But the reality is that for many Tibetan people, although they might wish to adopt a vegetarian lifestyle, simply don't have that luxury, because many parts of Tibet are above the tree line. It's very dry, it's very high altitude, and there's very little vegetation that is able to grow. And so nomads in particular live off the meat and dairy of specifically the yak, but other animals that are able to survive at high elevation as well. So I think things are changing inside of Tibet now that many nomads have been resettled away from these lands in towns and cities, and there is a certain pressure to adopt more vegetarian lifestyle.
And you are from Tibet. Namaste.
Definitely. Yeah, namaste. Yeah, it's Indian and Nepal they use, but we called and Tibetan calls it Dahidali.
Yeah. We have a lot of people come into our restaurant or to our food stall, and they may have spent time in India and make this assumption that Namaste is the greeting for all, but it's not a word that Yeshi would have known at all until he himself moved to India.
Mm-hmm. So, if I just want to say a simple hello to a Tibetan, what would be the right phrase to use?
Oh, Dahidali.
And it's one of those phrases that you can use in lots of different circumstances. If someone's raising a glass to you, you would also say tahidale. So it's cheers, it's hello, it's how are you doing? It's all those things rolled into one. Wow. So get you quite far, further than namaste.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you so much for playing this round of Rapid Bias, Yeshi and Julie. Now, to wrap up the conversation, I know that except for Taste Tibet, you both have two beautiful children who enjoy making momos and helping out in the kitchen from time to time. So how do they feel about their Tibetan heritage? And do they ever wonder about or get questions about their identities?
This is so interesting because I think for a lot of, I would say in my experience, the majority of kids born away from the country that one parent comes from, and which is not possible to visit very often, they would often kind of reject that second identity or feel uncomfortable about it. But in the case of our kids, they firmly describe themselves as Tibetan. They're not English, British, they are Tibetan. So they clearly feel very strongly that this is their identity as well. And we don't really know where that's come from, but we think that's wonderful. I mean, one thing is we've been able to visit family a couple of times out in Tibet. So of course that has, the context is everything. So, meeting family and seeing, observing that way of life was obviously, deeply meaningful for them.
But also we eat the Tibetan food at home all the time. So that's also from the food is the key as well.
Yeah, I think that's also definitely
children
true.
Really their favorite things are Tibetan food.
All their favorite dishes are Tibetan dishes as well.
So
when it comes to, I think because they're 10 and 8 now, maybe it will happen more as they get older. And we mentioned that Oxford is a pretty international place. So, in their school, they're not alone in looking different. But, if people do ask them where they're from, they'll say very proudly that they're Tibetan. And by and large, I think that's quite meaningless for everybody else because nobody can put Tibet on the map. They don't know where that is. But, I think perhaps that, makes them feel special in their difference. It's certainly something that they so far are proud of. And we really hope that they don't lose that pride in their Tibetan identity as they get older.
That's beautiful to know that they are already proudly Tibetans since a young age. And for our audience who are curious to check out your food and cookbook, what would be the best ways to reach you guys, either on social media or like any website?
Well, we're really active on social media. Instagram is probably the best medium, but we're on Facebook and Twitter as well. And we write a blog which we post to social media every week. But if you want it in your inbox, join our mailing list. But the book, for us is the kind of beautiful roundup of who we are and what we're doing and what we cook. So between all of that, I think hopefully you will enjoy.
And also enjoy anybody who interested by the book. Just it's a recipe. It's very easy and very fresh. So it's a delicious And the recipe there, I recommend, the special noodles.
If you're looking for recipes, that's where they are.
Yeah, noodles, they're so delicious. So
I'm going to be ordering my copy, seeing how there is no Tibetan restaurants in Hong Kong. So that's my only way into trying out Tibetan food, which is making my own.
Brilliant.
Now, finally, what does it mean to be proudly Tibetan?
Tibet's like very unique. We kind of understand where we live in, like in a Buddhist way, like kind of how we to live. If you have some challenge or something, that we're kind of easy to adapt to on the challenge. It's very, very different. The Tibetan people live in other countries. They're just always very easy to adapt.
Mm-hmm. And look after each other.
Yeah, look after each other,
Whether you're inside Tibet or outside of Tibet.
Yeah, everywhere. Just, they understand much better.
Mm-hmm.
And it's to help each other. And that's also what I'm doing here as well. If you have some food, I'd have to give to homeless people, That's my culture from the many generations. So
Nice.
Does that answer it? It's very complicated, I think.
Yeah.
But I do think the world has a lot to learn from, the Tibetan way of living, because a lot of it's like kindness, just basically taking care of people around you and animals around you as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this conversation with us, Yeshi and Julie. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so
It was
much.
a pleasure for us too.
That's it for this episode of Proudly Asian. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram @proudly.asian for more content. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Thanks for tuning in. Signing off for now, I'm Isabel Wong.
This